On the Jambanya Shashi, that Jambanya Shashi, Miba Karesne, Lu, Tsowa, Sem, Chögyi, and Jambanyi Mipache. Ne Miba Chibutela, Mije, Jambanya Shasadi, and the Kanji more like this, and that didn't or Kanskumgore Lana, Rangi Tsini, Ji Tsini, Ni, Pata, Shet Jambeti, Shet up Jebache, and the Gombe Kumbo rest. It's not Kumbo, come not in the Kumbo Reserva. Nana Gombi Goba Roji Cargino, Gombi Goba Carre Lamna, Daddy Casa, Dambodi, then Yana Dang, and Jajusembati, Kaba Carriore Lamna, then Yana, and Bucomiodu, and Mipatilla, Ludelena Rangulu, Rancone Lule Migores, and that's so I Rancone Soal Migores. Jesusamanamgi and Dashin Nigi Lul Migores, Migbe Yula Kaba Yorecere. Da comes to delay Naya, that Jamanyasha community, Yandu Ranja de Gigi and Rangiche and Chi Tseni, Mida Dunga Dunga, Gaza Dame Bashi Kumores. Jesusamana Yuzo, Mida Dunga Dunga Dame, Digan the Dozo, Tombanyukumores, Tombanyukumores, comes to the Kaba Yorce. And that Goba Karichidu Kumgorelane. Denshi Landor la Chupichido on the Kumgore. And Denji Landola can the Juralane, Ludembaneja Commude, Dunga de Bago, Wores, Dunga de Balo. And then Sword Maneja Commude, Dunga de Meju, Kunju Demba, and then how Wores, Kunju de Balcomores. Then it Sem Dambaneja Commude, and the Gortin now Wores. Then it Church Maneja Commude, Lamden Juru Wores. Then it's a Dishi Gombegi and Dembashila Comnach Dita Dires, Goba Dires. The Nezadang has a kissing share delata, Dunga Demba, the Lutemba Neja Comne, Dunga Demba, Kanachu as a Tigor, and then other share kissing my shoes are share.
Good morning. So today we're going to continue to look at the practice of the 4 close placements of mindfulness. When we started to look at this a few months ago, we looked at the 4 observed objects, which are body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, and with their various subcategories, which comprise all phenomena within those 4 observed objects. Thereafter, we looked at the second outline, how to engage in the meditation on those observed objects. And we saw that this is done with mindfulness and wisdom together, investigating first the specific characteristic of each observed object, and thereafter the general characteristics. And this was the common or shared way to meditate on the 4 close the objects of the first 4 close placements. And it's common because practitioners of all types engage in meditation in that way. Then we looked at the uncommon way to engage in the meditation. Uncommon in that it's not shared by all practitioners. It's specific to how bodhisattvas additionally meditate on the observed objects through the practice of the 4 close placements of mindfulness. And we saw that whilst the Tibetan practitioners, hearers and solitary realizers, they have as their observed objects their own body, their own feelings, their own mind, their own phenomena relating to themselves. Bodhisattvas do so in relation to all beings, themselves and all beings. And in terms of the engagement, the mental engagement, then those of the hearer and solitary realizer lineage primarily focus on, amongst the 4 general characteristics, primarily focus on selflessness. And for bodhisattvas, in addition to meditating on through the 4 general characteristics, bodhisattvas will primarily focus on cultivating the wisdom, realizing emptiness. So there is a second difference, and the third is the attainment that they achieve. Then we have now come to look at the third outline, the purpose of this meditation. And we see that each of the close placements of mindfulness practices leads to one skillfully or successfully engaging in the cultivation of one of the Four Noble Truths, respectively. Through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on the body, one skillfully engages with the truth of suffering. Through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, one engages with the truth of origin. And through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on the mind, one engages in the practice of meditating on true cessations. And through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on phenomena, one engages in the truth of paths. And then last week in our final session, we looked at the first of these four, that through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on the body, you will come to know that suffering is the entity of the appropriated negative state of the contaminated body. In other words, true sufferings.
ane ji tsinyo gom na de le khabar sa de da she di an rang yu ba da sem zam be ku sung da res zhen ten yu ba ina ane ji tsinyo gom ya de la nian de da rang ye chen shi sem su yi ne di de do dung ha me ka se me da ba dung ha dong wa che an da me ba de ne dong ba yu gom ba ji ba le ma khabar yo ma le che de ne me ni jera ma wa don de ba ro shi na ane ko zo gom na khabar yo ma cha sa je shi sem ba ina da me ba ko me ma do 지승에 담에 보고 막 연락 남게 담에 보고 막 지발이 개발요 말해서 어 개발요 다들 개발 요래서 해야지 란유바다 샘점비게 송하로 제해서.
Last time we also spoke about how the different Buddhist philosophical tenets, they have differing interpretations of this practice. So when I taught that for example, when I taught that the mental engagement of hearers and solitary realizers differs from that of bodhisattvas, that was the presentation in accordance with the view of the Chittamatras and Svachantikas, in that it's them who assert that the hearers and solitary realizers will primarily engage in the meditation on the general characteristic of selflessness, and bodhisattvas additionally will engage primarily in the meditation cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness. The schools of the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, they do not make that differentiation because they do not assert emptiness. They only assert selflessness. So therefore they would say practitioners of all types only, or would primarily meditate on the general characteristic of selflessness. So they make no distinction. Prasangika Madhyamika, they too make no distinction between the various types of practitioner, but they say that the wisdom realizing selflessness is the wisdom realizing emptiness, that they don't make a distinction there because they have a different understanding of selflessness. And therefore they say all practitioners cultivate the wisdom realizing emptiness. So that was also mentioned last week.
dunga demba di se di nga zu dunga demba da ham ku go mare ta nga zo la ka nga di the de dunga demba ha ku go mare zi dunga demba da ham go wa yin za ane dunga yu kun ju demba de ya da ha ku go mare zi di me ham go za de la tar de ge sam ba ki tu go mare zi dunga demba ha go go de be ma se ge chim yu che go de ne yin za ne dunga demba de ge chim bu yin za ane sanye jumnen di yuche dangbo songyo de ne tenpa yi songdo dunga tenpa sa de dunga sheba cha sa dunga tenpa di dangbo songwa re dunga di haku gore dunga tenpa haku gore es jine de dangbo dunga tenpa di shingwa che gore es ane di songwa re da nga zuge da lobjong lamrim da nyamnen di kane songyo de dangbo dunga tenpa gore nga zu kibu chungyo lamyirim tumo lamyirim ba sheyo de nga zuge ane jige dunga tempa koshi nga zu lui di ane kechi jibi me dabari asa da ane jiga korbi ki kamsungi korbi dunga chasa je gebi lui chasa ane Geshe Jibe Rashi Dunga Kasore Dunga Yu Dunga Chaba Duji Dunga said Dunga didn't Yungure said she Dunga Dembashi or Jazanga Dunga Demba Hawaii Chido Disungor what is a Dineza Dunga Dembashingo Giechemoshu Chago Reserva.
And also last time, when we looked at how one comes to understand true sufferings through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on the body, I also mentioned how this is a meditation of crucial importance for us, because whilst we have an understanding of suffering, and due to your knowledge, you'll have an acceptance of the various subtle layers of suffering. This is something we have yet to realize. And because we haven't realized true sufferings, we are unable yet to realize true origins, and without realizing true origins, one cannot generate definite emergence. The strong determination to renounce the cyclic existence in its entirety and strive for liberation. And therefore, Buddha Shakyamuni taught that true sufferings must be known. Or he taught, suffering must be known. And in the Lamrim, this is also greatly emphasized. True sufferings are meditated on and to be realized in the training shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, through reflecting on impermanence and thereafter on the sufferings of samsara, thereby coming to realize that as long as one has this basis of the contaminated aggregates, an illustration of all-pervasive suffering, one will continue to be bound in misery, bound in cyclic existence, experiencing the sufferings of physical and mental pain and transient pleasure. So this we also looked at last week, and it serves to emphasize that this is a key meditation for all of us to engage in.
Dine kunju denpa de hakoya le la chekora. Karasana dunga denpa de hakoya de chisa dunga yu gyu di karas chepa che de kunju denpa de hakoya le la chekora.
When one, to the extent that one comes to know true sufferings or even realize true sufferings, to that extent one can come to know or realize true origins, because as one comes to realize the result, one will seek out that cause.
Tisanda ngando dunga de la sumchi yorba dunga yu dunga gyu yu dunga chaba duji dunga sayade ta ngarang zuye kar haku korasine dunga yu dunga de haku kore tsowa dunga chi de tisanda dunga yu dunga haku aje dunga yu dunga de ane sayage dondala ngarang zuye da jige tabshi tamara jigo yorba di jet kore dunga de nekab setuwa yungore rwa da dine ta ngarang zuye kar haku kore marasine gyuwe dunga de dunga yin baha kukuwa mara, kyaba duji ki dunga de dunga yin baha, dunga ha kukuwa mara, tanga zay. Kyaba duji ha kukuwa mara, gyuwe dunga ha kukuwa mara. Ta gyuwe dunga la na nga do sachi ki tsoga dewa di ki gyuwe dunga, nga zo kala saya dang, dine ton zo tiki yuwa di, nga zo ki dulo kwaya dang, nga chik sim chik kale kaje, dine ngisi kya do lele chaya, dewa ki loya di tsoga dewa di, di nga zo ki di gyuwe dunga ri, nga zo gyuwe dunga ha moga che, di dewa ranga se, tengi dewaru disam nganzo disam digor da disam je di raya gi dondala bezu che digor ba da nganzo jisan gyuwe dunga se de nganzo hago ma ra da dina ne da nganzo gi phungbo di chaba du ji dunga se wa di nganzo dunga i ba hago go ma ra jisa dine za da nganzo gi di chaba du ji dunga se de kan chi la wo re la yo de jisa nganzo phungbo di yu le da nyomo be dene Gyälwa za gyu le da nyumo unge Gyälwi rangwa me ba ane xiangwa de rangwa me ba ane jige rangwa me de gen gyu le da nyumo unge Gyälwi gen deya rangwa me ba giji gyuwa zho de gen dene je ha go yo de ma za ha go yo de da nga zu phungbo di ane phungbo de la dene dunga yong yo ba da gyu dunga yong yo ba dunga shandan yi ne je be ge dene je ha go yo de ane nga zu ge duji dunga set ha고 거래. 제가 duji dunga 하고 해도 아니 dunga 이 가서 dunga 대바 set 하고 와래. 당연히 dunga 대바 dunga지 멋인 봐래 다들.
to come to realize suffering, there are various presentations of or divisions of suffering that one can meditate on to come to understand and realize suffering. So there's the threefold, the sixfold, and eightfold division of suffering. Most commonly, we talk about the threefold division. And of the threefold division, it's only the first that we recognize as suffering, with the first being the suffering of physical and mental pain. So this we do recognize as suffering, and therefore we engage in a wide variety of activities, and our mental activity too is to a large extent directed towards ensuring we do not experience physical or mental pain. So this first of the three types of suffering we do recognize, but the second and the third, the suffering of transient happiness and all-pervasive suffering, these two we still do not recognize as suffering. And whilst you may have certain of her teachings on these and accepted through the teachings that these are sufferings, that knowledge is yet to be integrated, and we can see this in that how we long for experiences of transient pleasure. For example, we delight in delicious food, we delight in companionship, we delight in relaxation. So these are experiences of worldly happiness, mundane happiness, transient pleasures. And these are too in the nature of suffering, but we are yet to truly recognize this. Then the third type of suffering, that of all-pervasive suffering, this refers to that our physical and mental aggregates are in the nature of suffering because of being attained without freedom, without choice, due to them being propelled by a contaminated karma that was accumulated by our own afflicted minds. And therefore, our physical and mental aggregates are an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. So long as we have this basis of the physical and mental aggregates, we will continue to experience suffering. The two types of physical and mental pain and that of transient happiness come about independence on this basis, which is an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. When we come to realize this third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering, that is when we come to know true sufferings.
Leda nyomo shawa jinu juba ne kiji chiba du cheba chi ji chenyi lu de ngo ji chenyi di de do mi da ba da an du ngo wa cheba chi du ne phungbo di lu kiji chibi ra shin an de yu da jin leda nyomo ba de ne ki ya du che za ko shi le yin ge shawa ju ra wa me ba da ha go ya du ne du ngo de ba ha go re se chi na zu ge da lu de ba nya cha kom be ge an du ngo de ba le ya an ju zhuo da nyam len jie ta de an du du xiong ko re xin de ke xin da xu cha ba che da de nga zu de kar chu ba re sen da de ne ge nga zu phung bo de da de ne ge le da nyom mo ka so re du nga ge ra xin an de le du nga gyu du nga ju ya ge ka mo bo yo sa ge ne de ne chi na di da gyu di ga ne chung go re che zang gyu ga ne re se che ba che yo du da nga zu ka so re kun ju de ba da ha ko ko wa 다디 가는 사고를 쓰는 걸로 초화된바 예자 공명도 네 군주에 대바다 하고 그래서 제가 군주에 초화된 예자 공백이 군주 된바 신안에 군주 된바를 주르고 냠는 지고를 해야 돼. 어디 거셔야 되다. 공부를 때는 연구를 해야 돼. 자, 먼저 디지 둥아세 규에 가서 둥아 덴바 하고 단 가르치는 간도 풍보디 안에 레다 가서래 기지기지 지배를 하신 안에 규레다 념벌을 때에 깨와 풍보 될라 때에 둥아 용어도 규에 둥아 용거래서 진짜 둥아는 규에 둥아도 땡지고 시땡지고래서 어디 시간에 가서 제네 치어도 안에 거 잡아주지 둥아 임바 시고로 진짜 둥아 덴바 하고 거래서 dunga temba haku gores da dine da she da nga to cho di gyu ga re yung gores da dine gi phungbo di ge gyu ga ne le yung gores de da kunyu temba tin yung du gores ya de da no cho wa de temba ni ja kombe ge haku gores di go shi ya de se to le da ni dunga ni ji ting gi ju ji go re le da nyu mo ju ki ji gi ji be ra shin re la bi dunga temba haku go la de cha ba du ji dunga lo go go da di la go da di re da.
We concluded last time by emphasizing that in our own meditation, what we should focus on is the first two general characteristics in relation to the body, reflecting that it is impermanent, it changes momentarily, and therefore is unreliable, it's unstable, it will end, and we must utilize what remains of this opportunity well. Moreover, the second characteristic is being suffering, or in the nature of suffering, is that this body was attained without freedom, without control. And that's because it came about in dependence on causes and conditions. And those causes and conditions are contaminated karma accumulated through afflicted minds. And therefore, it is in the nature of suffering. So these two general characteristics, primarily, we should be meditating on. Now today, we'll come to looking at where our experiences of suffering of the suffering of physical mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness come from. What are their causes? In other words, true origins. And we come to know true origins through reflecting on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings. So that's where we're going to start today.
That's all I mean. 다른 초점만이죠 공유도 다랑이 챙이다 지 챙이 이네 공유도 안에 군주대 하고 그래라로 다 간에서 하고 그래라도 당아 저기 나뭐 초와세디 안에 간에서 제바 지고라서네 초와세디 아 저기 안에 유디 대도 가야로 대도 뇽위기 안에 지게 뇽위기 되네 뇽화치래 사디 되네기 하고 해야지 다 저기 뭐 어디 공부 써야 되지 나 되네기엔 초와디야 기지기지 집이 미다바래 사다 안에 누가 말하시랬어 저디 가서 당한 초와디 끼어도 초와 되네 질때는 두 신의 초와디 뭐였어 다 초와디 안델레델레 안에 갈리고도 섬도 제바치디 갑라 아주게 초원 대원들레 때네 갈리고도 쓰네 아주레 대와들레 차바기도 오지래 대 초와 대와래 기운도 초와 대화들라 차바기도 하나 주길라 지상 초와 대화들라 차바기에도 초와 대화들 빼는 하나 주 디용으로다 초와 대화라 베네 지게 제 베네 잘라라 차바기 되네기 유 잘라라 차바기 차바기에도 되네 같이 그랬으네 잘라기 잘라들하나 야구여라 샘비게 나 소와 대화실리기로 변한 아주 잘라닝이 지고 지라나 아데 야구라 선생을 라선스 비 대화 소와 대화 수수기 소와 대화실리기로 지상 수수 소와 대화지 델레 미시네 아니 잘라라 미비기 차바기 소와 대화들 소와 대화를 차도 소와 대화디기 녀에게 유디 라에게 된다라 안 녀모바기 거래 제 차바 녀모디 라에 된 베지치고래 대나싱아 저기 변에 샤사기 도 뇽비도 샤사이 델이야 차바 소와 대화 델하라지 리고로 와당아 저기 되네 대화시 리고 되네기 레요도 되네기 소와 대화라 차요도 아니 소와 대화디 되네기 유디 셰디 뇽비 조들 차바인사 디샤르 라야게 돈달라 안 셈제 소치치야다 되네기 제네 레사 남바 량amba 사고레샤지 초와 대화라 차비 다 초와 대화라 차비 왕기 차바게 유디를 초와 대화지게 될라 디 차비 왕기는 셴랴 아니 체위기 레다 셴르 네비 레 안디보 망고사고레제 지자 레양amba 사고레제 네 데니기 레 사비기 레기 제보텔라 데네데네 내가 저기 징나솔 기고레사다 안디나신 초와 동아지 끼야도 초와 동아디 되고 말다 초와 동아디단 자두기 삼바 차고죠 자 되네 자고 선배 자두기 삼바 기고라 된 잘스는 고메스 잘서 초와 둥아게도 초와 둥아들 자두게 삼바게 지상 초와 둥아들 자고 선배 삼바게도 되는 디왕게 안나 저기 샬라 뇌베지야 뇌바지야가다 신 심지 소주제바 샬라 뇌베게 자와 몽부치고 디자에도 량 바사고 해야지 어두스네 삼당고 해야지
One comes to know, to understand true origins through reflecting on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings. As we saw in the preceding outline, the common way to engage in that meditation, or the shared way to engage in that meditation, is first through the specific characteristic. So that's where we start, coming to reflect on the specific characteristic of feelings, and thereafter we reflect on the general characteristics of feelings. Seeing how the first general characteristic is that of impermanence, that it changes momentarily. So for example, what we're looking at here is seeing that when a feeling arises, what results from that feeling, as well as what causes the rise of that feeling. So we look at this process. So for example, most commonly, when a feeling of happiness, or to translate it in a different way, a pleasant feeling, when that arises, it usually leads to the arisal of attachment. So we have a pleasant feeling and attachment follows. So for example, in relation to attachment to a material object, first there is a pleasant feeling in relation to that material object. This is where, and from that, attachment for that object comes. So the pleasant feeling towards that object arises, and from this attachment comes thinking how wonderful it will be that I have it, and one, therefore through attachment one tries to possess it. So for example, thinking if a sentient being who enjoys meat, for them a pleasant feeling arises, or a feeling of happiness arises in relation to the texture and the taste of meat. And from this then, attachment to eat meat arises. And this then results in behavior, such as killing the animal so that it can be eaten. So what we're looking at here is that through the arisal of a pleasant feeling, attachment follows. And from this afflicted mind of attachment, one often engages in non-virtue. Engaging in non-virtue, one accumulates powerful karmic seeds, which, if they ripen as a propelling karma, will lead to rebirth in the lower realms. So the purpose then of this meditation is to come to understand this process of how, in relation to an object, a feeling of a pleasant feeling arises. From this, attachment arises. From that, negative karma arises. Non-virtuous karma is accumulated rather.
di video banza delea di moyang tandala nga ju dulo tu ko ya de ji go ro ndi na xian an ju ge ji ge ge hap je bi ne be ne chilo ge mi jap jo mong bu le be ne di khar sen ne di ne mong bu le na ngan zo le ya nga ju ge de mi mi nga ju ge mi de le ya ka nga che gi res je san di ka nga di ani kha ba ne ka nga che gi sam je de ni delea ani ka nga di mi de banza di se tandala capture your idea Pakaya that in Rua. I ask Sosugi the Gangat and Tradugi, the Nigga Tawa de la Chapaki, Chape Wangi Sigoro. That in a young Jugi been a such a roach in me such a Takap 소소랑기 사지면에 샹다 사지디기 봤다 초원에 지해 저러봐다 제디 착바게제 딩안줄라는 안줄이 디기 용구래 안줄 디기 강할 때 디기 망아 용구래 베제타 망아 즉 튕기를 망아지 디는 안줄게 디기 망아 용구래스네 소수게 디기를 차제 되니게는 미샹다게 차제 되니게는 디라이 돈달라 샹다게 사지 초야다 잘라 초야 제베는 디원길에 사교바데 되니 지교바데 안줄기다 라바라바르마제 세부르 통화 줘르바데네 아저 디가르스네 되던달라 가르치고르스네 샹다게 잘라 초야다 사지 초야게 소수기 게하우 오메나야 다원 초야데 가르스네 델레 차바기고 소수기 디기딜레 차 데니자는 안줄레 디기 망아용을 베제 망아 죽투거스 소설리에 민기 디기 땀년다기 디기 안에 소수기 변조기 디기 디기레 차제네 데니게 초야 현 가야다 샹랴 툭세 따야다 샹랴 마자이네 소수기 강아 오콘주기 디제는 안줄레 강아 체기도 디자 코도 메와서 마자야다 진짜 소수기 제사 강아를 초와 동아들이 미디베치네 녀모 온기 샹랴 네베 먹어야다 안 소소 디기레 차제 차비 원기 안 샹랴 네베 먹어야다 디니 지고레선 제사 착바지 초와 대화당 동아들라 때네 차바기고라시 돈달라 델미체 차바기고라 초와 대화들라 미리 차바기 초와 동아래 차바기고라시 초와 동아게 자되게 차바 초와 대화들 주되게 차바 되네 차바기고라시래 델미베 차바기고라시 그 유디를 가르쳐서 초와 대화라 차바이 차바 딩알라 라고 차바 초와 동아들이 drago도 셈비게 자되게 차바 차바기고 지선 초화될 때네 가르치고서는 아직 차바기고 그러지 차바기 유지고 그러지 나랑 저기라 맞아 가사 파파다지 말고 나랑 저기 더 코아바데 소리 지고래라로
Forms of attachment, as we've already looked, arise from feelings of happiness, but they can also arise from feelings of suffering or unpleasant feelings. In that, from pleasant feelings, the attachment of wanting something follows. But from unpleasant feelings, wanting to be separated follows. So we can also understand this as a type of attachment, the wanting to be separated from. So, for example, this morning it's a little bit cold for us, hence we're wearing warm clothing because a feeling or an unpleasant feeling has arisen. We're wanting to be separated from the feeling of cold, hence we're wearing warm clothing. So we see here that there's an unpleasant feeling that arises, leading to attachment, the attachment of wanting to be separated from this unpleasant feeling, and thereby we engage in activity. We wear warmer clothing. And we see many examples throughout our daily life as well as in society, so those that are easy to understand, is we look at an all too common reaction to immigrants and in particular to refugees arriving in many countries. So there's often a vocal part of the community who say, we do not want foreigners coming here, we do not want to have refugees coming here, because their presence and the impact on our society will be primarily negative and they will harm those of us who are living here. We don't want them, and thereby reject the opportunity to help them. So what we have here is an arisal of an unpleasant feeling, and from that immediately comes attachment to be separated from the object. So you have the object, the arisal of the unpleasant feeling towards the object, and then the attachment to be separated from the object. Thereafter, action follows, activity follows. Where people vocalize saying, we want to be separated from refugees. We don't want to help foreigners coming to our country. We look at conflicts between nations. So here, you could have, for example, a unpleasant feeling towards a neighbor, a neighboring nation, and from this one wants to become separated from them. And that can lead, that attachment to wanting to be separated from them can lead to conflict. Or it may be a desire for their material wealth, and therefore conflict follows. Or a desire for greater reputation, and therefore conflict follows. But what these all have in common is a thought primarily of our own happiness, and thereby harm to others follows. What we see through these illustrations is a feeling rises, whether a pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling, and that leads then to attachment. If it's a pleasant feeling, it will be an attachment of wanting something, wanting another country's material wealth, wanting reputation, and thereafter that leads to activity, verbal or physical, or further mental activity. Similarly, if it's an unpleasant feeling, attachment arises, wanting us to be separated from that object towards which we have the unpleasant feeling. That then leads to either further mental activity, or verbal activity, or physical activity. So this is the role that feelings play in the links between the continuity between the object and the arisal of the affliction, such as attachment, and resulting further activity. There's this connection here of feeling, whether pleasant or unpleasant.
Chowa dewa la chakpe ki chakpa, dewa de trubdu ki chakpa ki, chowa dunga de la dradu ki pa chakpa ki. Chizan dini ki chakpa ki yadu, pina chowa dunga ki yadu, dunga de la dradu ki, kontra ki kirwa, de dunga la kontra ki yada. Di wangi kansi le, zuki ta ngaji nyomo pa ki yungu res, duya kontra nga kia nyomo pa ki yungu res, nga zu chowa de la teni. Chizanda nyomomba kiyandu, nyomomba kiyandu di wange lenga basa kores, lenga basa. Lenga basa di wange da le di wange, le ngamba sabayna, nyawa da nga son kiya da. Dan kewi leji sabayna, nga zuki lada miu kiya. Chizanda le da leje, nyomomba ki, nyomomba le sa, le yi wange nga zu kowa kiya. Chizanda nga zu pungpo di, le da nyomo ba le ne ki do as de jing as dunga de ba se de dunga de ba che san dunga yu dunga che san den je se pungbo de lu di ka ri jin yong se na le da nyomo ba le ne ki do le da nyomo ke de dang bo le de kan se ke zo nyomo ba le ne ki do nyomo ba de kan se so yu cho wa de do la cha ba se cha ne ki do as cha ne yong do da de ne ki an de yang za wa kan se yong do lab na 대야 nga sebe nga an dao tu zhuba zimbe dasen kye she an jisa dangbo nga sebe nga dao zhuba dasen kye dene nga dasen kye ne dene nga la deki kogudu sebe deya nga la dewa kogudu nga la dunga kogu ma re se on dus che ne de nyombo ki go re jisa dus che de jisa dangbo nga sebe nga dao tu zhuba dasen kye dela dene nyombo ba kye nyombo ke le sa dene ki che bala dene nga zu pungpo zhukudu se 지사 되는 인상 아주 풍부디 계기 유조디 가서 레다 녀모바 디나 유조디 다시 마릭 바드레샤스는 두스는 제바치나 다시 마릭 바드 하고요도 가고도 있는 아주 군지대 발로 주고 그래서 소화자만이 조금 군지대 발로 주고 그래서 되는 시고로다 주고 되는데 군지대 배게 당 아주 동아대 바드 규디 군지대 바 임바도 못 추고 그래지 하고 그래서 소와 동아기도 공로기를 받은 거다. 소와 동아기도 미치기 가지고 이제와 미치기 측수벌라 소와 동아기 막아봐 소와 동아기가 이람상 퀄리티로 와. 이제와 나 집에 이제와
what I've just presented then hopefully shows clearly that from either the arisal of a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling towards an object, attachment can follow. Attachment wanting that object, and that would come from a pleasant feeling, or attachment wanting to be separated from that object, and that attachment wanting to be separated from that object, and that would come from a suffering feeling. Suffering feelings, though, can also lead to, for example, the affliction of anger arising. Doesn't necessarily have to mean that attachment follows. So anger, when a suffering feeling arises in relation, or an unpleasant feeling arises in relation to an object, then anger can follow from that unpleasant feeling, and that mere arisal of the affliction accumulates non-virtuous karma, and certainly so too if one acts out under the influence of that affliction, either through verbal communication or through one's activity. And this non-virtuous karma, when it ripens, it will ripen in rebirth in the lower realms. If this non-virtuous karma ripens as a propelling karma, it will propel rebirth into the lower realms. But even if from, for example, a pleasant feeling towards an object, attachment arises, and one accumulates thereby non-virtue, this too can ripen in as a propelling karma, propelling a rebirth into the lower realms. But even when one accumulates virtue, this too follows the same chain, and when one accumulates virtue, there is still the presence of feelings and the presence of afflictions, and therefore when virtuous karma ripens and propels a rebirth, a good rebirth will follow in the higher realms, such as a human or God, but it'll still be a rebirth within samsara, and therefore the body will still be, or the aggregates will still be in the nature of suffering. Now if we take this chain and we go deeper, the chain we've looked at thus far is we have the accumulation of karma, preceding that we have afflictions, preceding that we have the consciousness or mental factor of feeling, whether pleasant or unpleasant. Preceding that we have object. But we can place now, if we look deeper, between the object and the arisal of feeling, the ignorance of self-grasping, that root affliction, that root cause of all our suffering. So why does the ignorance of self-grasping then come between the object and the ripening of the feeling? Well, it's the ignorance of self-grasping that because the ignorance of self-grasping believes that the self exists truly or inherently, exists in the way that it appears, therefore comes the thought, this self wants to be happy, and therefore feelings of happiness comes. This self wants to be freed from suffering, and from that a feeling to be separated arises. And that it would usually be, or a feeling of suffering, which could lead then to attachment, wanting to be separated, or anger arising. So therefore, this chain has as its roots the ignorance of self-grasping. This ignorance that either wants something, from this ignorance we have the thought of I want, because I want to be happy, and therefore from this perhaps pleasant feeling attachment comes, or I want to be freed from suffering, and thereby an unpleasant feeling arises, and from that comes attachment, wanting to be separated, or anger, and from that non-virtuous karma. So now, when we take in this root cause of the ignorance of self-grasping, this way we come to understand true origins, the origin of this entire sequence that leads to uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence and the perpetuation of suffering.
지나는 것도 초와 잠바냐샤 고미도 나 초와 세대 아니 둥아다 대두니스로 초와 대화를 미베 차바 둥아를 미베 제 자두게 삼바 대두니 자와다 미자와 대비기 세비기 미치 지상 초와 대두글 때네 초와 는 가르치시는 세바게 규칙도 호서 세비기 미치를 지나다 니 미치 제비고냐 또라 세되다 지상 초와 세디 규가를 때서 가서 그래 세바 세디 규가를 ting교슨 초와 대두글 미시 세바기도 와세지 니 대비군 때 세바 대양사 군중의 조인비 세도 지상 세바 될라 때네 지상 군중의 유조의 제거 세바 될라 때네 아주 량아 바 레사야디 세바 될라 기기네 사고라 지상은 코발에 계획 레사야디 세바 되네 기고 지 세바 메나 코발에 계획 레사요 말에 레사바 있네요 세바 메나 코발에 기돼요 말 지상 한쪽에 당보 레사야 대양 세바를 때네 아니 코발에 계획 레사고 그러지 레사 사회 제려야 아니 코발에 기르치뒤 양 세바기 세바기지 세비 긴제 니마 레사 샤바디 레기 니버디 야 니버디 쳇다지 세바기 세비 니버 쳇다 되는 아주 코발에 껴바지 거래 지도 디네에서 세바디 군중기 다 코발에 기 군중세도 군중세도 코유 동안나서 군 차상 중해 유조디 세바디 지거래스 되네 인자 되네기 제바체도 되네 하고 거래스 되네 하고에도 딥 아니 디pon을 제바다시 디pon도게 삼발리기 되시래.
Let's then read this relevant part in the text. So on page 5, the second point, through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, you will strive to abandon pleasant and unpleasant feelings, which are the cause of cravings, desiring either to be separated or not separated, and when considered from the point of view of their results, are the primary origin of suffering. So this accords with what I've presented thus far. But if we're more specific to what is being identified here, it's a little deeper than we've gone thus far. Because we've spoken thus far about the accumulation, the role that feelings play in the accumulation of contaminated karma. What is being referred to here is specifically to do with taking uncontrolled rebirth, which means continuing to take rebirth in cyclic existence, continuing life after life to have appropriated contaminated aggregates. When, you will strive to abandon pleasant and unpleasant feelings, which are the causes of cravings. So that's what we've looked at already. Desiring either to be separated or not separated. We've also looked at that. And when considered from the point of view of their results, are the primary origin of suffering. So here this is in additionally referring to, at the point of death, craving arises. Craving arises for a new body, a new life. But specifically, and so this craving then grasps at the attainment of a new life, and this leads to this has the power or the potency that ripens and imprints at the time of death. So it's this craving at the time of death that has the potency to ripen and imprint, and that imprint, that karmic imprint, is contaminated karma, because that is what has been accumulated thus far. Karma contaminated by the afflictions. The motivation that led to the accumulation of karma was mixed with afflictions, hence it's contaminated. And those afflictions came from the presence of feelings. So now at the time of death, the mind of craving, the consciousness of craving, this ripens an imprint, a contaminated imprint, and that propels another rebirth in samsara, another rebirth that we take without freedom, without control, due to the potency of craving a new life, ripening a contaminated imprint.
아디네 자당한 주기 초와 제디 지상한 주기 초와 잠반이샤 고명도 두신의 kunju demba de hago to go res ha kunju demba hago go chesa dene hago de demba shi na ne dangan ju kunju demba la ya an chowa demba ni jo ko be kunju demba ju ba si de kunju demba gi ne so de hago go ba dene hago yo de da di pongo de le de hago de sambe samlo de gi ro wa dene za kunju demba la ju ba si de dan chowa demba ni jo ko be kunju demba ju ro re sa di ro wa.
Therefore, in this way, through meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, one comes to understand true origins. And in this way, because we saw right at the beginning, the purpose of this meditation is to engage in the practice of the Four Noble Truths. So it's this second one, the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, that leads one to engage in the practice on understanding true origins.
다던다라 가르숭고라서네 나주기 초와 대두라 미제 차바기 호레스 차바다네 동알 대두를 메베 차바기 차바디 원기 레사 레디 원기다 먼저 코알에 끼와래 용거래지래 달래용도 제상 나주기다데 대진이라 동아dim바 나주 풍보디게 사치기 류풍보 동아 야야 유에 동아 야야 아니 강아망고 태기 땡지세 시풍보디 아니 가르리 기기도서나 제자 풍보디 레기 되고 레라드네 기고레스 진짜 레디 가르친 리고레스네 반사고스네 차바게제 차바제 녀모바게제 디원기 레사고레제 다 차바디기도 스키요는 차바다 간스 기기도 랍데 유디기 가르라 미니 기기도 라베도 전 소와 디두를 미친데 차바기 용도 요모바기 용도 하스 비단 데네 인자 소와 디두를 때네 요모바기 용 대자 데네 인자 소와 디두를 때네 차바기 차바 원gel레사 디레기 원게 풍보 디징 아주 동화된 바세야디 레기 원거 준셔 제자다 동화디 유조디 가르 랍나 레다 요모바디샤스 다 디야 요모바디야는 가르 요모바세야디 되자 차바 대화라 차비 차바다 초와 동알을 자주게 차바디 간스리들네 나 집에 삼로디 나 집당보 나 지나기는 나를 디기 구구도 해야다 나를 동하 구매해서 제사다보 나 집에 나진지리도 지나다 녀모바에 나네 군주에 쪼데 가르스는 쪼대야데 나진 자위기 규디 다시 말해봐리 될래되네 차바 이때 나진게 나기 대화를 돼 동아 미도바제 이제 대화되어도 대화를 밑에 차바게 동아 밑에 동아다 자두게 차바게 다 되네기 차바게도 디우 견제는 대량한 바사 레몽보사 그래서 다 레사네다 나서게 레사 처리라 뭐 받는다 저기 마시로치도 양 대화를 차바게 차바디게 동아다 자두게 차바게 차바디 원기 아니면 레사시 레게 제보디 하자 니버디바 차르다제 나솔레 개와 린주 제가 레도 쇠샤 시장당 안주기 풍보 사치기 풍보 동아 덴바 세디 유조디다 레다 녀모바 디양 안에 군주 가서 다세 마릭바디 레샤 세네 두스체나 하고 요도 안에 데소 요아디다 제 초와 데수 데두르 미체네 아니 용도와 서 하고 요도 제가 니 땅아 저기 가서 그래 군주에 바임바 하고 세고 하고 용으로 하고 다 제사 디네 하고 요네 다 군주 덴바니네 시나네 군주 덴바를 주바 냠를 주바서 디주 하고 요데 디네 가르기 그래서 삼노 갈라 당아조 꽝아 때서 쪼디 디네 용구도와 다 디메바 소고도와 선배 삼도 리교로 받아 군주 덴바데
Through reflecting on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, one comes to understand the role that the consciousness of feeling plays, whether it's a pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling that arises. From this, afflictions follow. For example, usually it's attachment, the most common affliction that arises for us, and this will always follow a feeling, whether pleasant or unpleasant. So it will be there'll be an object that we'll observe. From this, perhaps a pleasant feeling arises, then attachment, wanting to possess that object arises. This then leads to the accumulation of karma, and that karma is contaminated because of the presence of the afflictions, and therefore, if it ripens as a propelling karma, it will lead to, once again, rebirth in samsara. Or even if it's a suffering feeling, an attachment follows from this. The attachment wanting to be separated from whatever is causing our unpleasant feeling. That too then leads to the accumulation of contaminated karma, and that then leads to, once again, uncontrolled rebirth in samsara. An uncontrolled rebirth in samsara means that these aggregates, our physical and mental aggregates, that are the basis of suffering, are so because they are in the nature of suffering, because of their causes. Contaminated karma, and that karma is contaminated due to having been accumulated by the afflicted minds. And therefore, our afflicted minds follow feelings, whether that is a pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling. And this is a key point to recognize, because it identifies the danger that even pleasant feelings play in our lives. Moreover, we dig a little deeper, that the rise of these feelings come from the ignorance of self-grasping, that this is the very root cause of our situation. So here we have this chain, that we have a consciousness of ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in a way that it does not, as existing truly or inherently. From this then, the various feelings, pleasant or unpleasant, arise, wanting things for the self, or the self to be separated from things. And thereby we accumulate, our afflictions arise, and we accumulate contaminated karma, and continue to take uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence. So here we see, having seen this chain, we recognize the very root cause is our ignorance of self-grasping. That is the origin of all our suffering. And thereby, through this meditation on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, we give rise to the strong desire to abandon true origins.
dunga mi deba chikpa sa shigurwa sungurwa dene dang ang ju gi dewa la sa di dewa de ang ju gi de she di ang ju le chowa dewa sa di dewa ngone de same gi dewa ng ju me ro da ang ju le sa chi gi dewa ma do yo ma sa chi dewa de gyu dunga sirwa de jing ju gyu dunga de cha gorwa jinan gyu dunga de le cha ri gorwa dang ang ju du sam da we ne bene ang ju gi 가르스 지게 둘로 지금 뭐냐 미질이야 안 지게 지 기신님 보시면 지금 미질이야 지게 콩로사베나 아주 가르치고서 가브리엘 초와 대화 등원이랑 아주 초와 대화지 초와 동화지 기에제 남사 미션의 콩로사리 그래 가브리엘 초와 동화지 매나야 소소 초와 동화지 기리에 삼제 마기 게 원고 치도 현려 콩로도 바용구로 와다 콩로사 원고 니를 맞이고는 원곡서라 원곡 해야 돼. 그래서 초등의 기기를 삼제 계획이 맞이 니를이야 맞이에게 까야게 마용에게 너나 탑시에잖아. 코너사지 아주 코너사야래. 근데 네 용구로와 근데 착바이나 다가로와 초와 대화지 기에지네 될차 하나 초와 대화디 라야기다데 요 말들이 라야기 된다라 맞지 배치 착바기 용구로 저 초와 대화라 차야. 진짜 차지 디 라야기 된다라 배치야. 디네 자당한 쪽에 변에 미질이야 콩로사와 있네 당한 수삼다면 가르치는 콩로사와래서는 아주 소소라 다 콩로사와 남사 콩로사도 콩로사와 소소 남사 하고 우르와가 콩로사기 요새 다디 콩로사야디 딱 두삼다면 아주 가르치는 콩로사와래서는 아주 십소우라 삼다면네 야나 미디기 넘규다 기시다 디네 소소리야 시에지네 소소리야 셈래야 초와지 기에지 콩로사요래 세고래 Yana diniki mena yang, and so some daji, or going al dinichi, telling Alakangati, dingy, the Donda, the Ko Tuku, Tuya Ko Pashi Chigre Samje, and Anzuki, Digi, Gangadi, Maya, Yungo, Yelene, Holianum Butenje, and there's corn light, then by the Yunguru Konsa Yungura, just an answer corner Sayadilia, Sayodu, and Shelia corner Sayadi, Nubi, Sambakia corner Yadi, Yana Anzuli, Soa Dungachi, Quay. 지금 교르다 기시다 마리베 토네가 소라 동아시 기 차지 근데네 소와 동아들라 직자주기 막아지 아니 가서 우리 파셔들래 걸어서 지금 그래 다 소와 동아 기메나 다 미디기 알아 먹어봐다가 네위 지기데 네 내가 제일 그 발시 지기데 삼제 안 소 디제만 소 동아리 용구래 삼 네네게 삼다지 아주 팔아야 안 되버지야다 아니 막아봐지야 돼 용구로 와 네네 삼다도 삼다वे나 Gyälwa magawa jedi 가르치는 연구를 해서 10초 삼다면 소수기 초와 동아 들라 미되바다 소수기 초와 대화 영화들 그 발치 제설에서 그 네버기사 삼제 magawa jedi 되는 용도와 제가 되는 인자 당한저 자위 투서디 소소 초와 디둑들 투 내야 안에 나세베 나세 나라 강아치기래 나라 디기 용고 말에 세야데 언도세 네 당하세 삼능일 다 되는 네 디기를 누기래 네 디기를 바지 지가 두비를 바지 지기래 나라야 안 동아 제사래 섬제 되네게 안에 삼다제 샹래 누비 자와치에디 바시 되네 리고로와
The way that very ordinary practitioners such as ourselves can approach this topic is, well, let's start with something that we hear many times, that there's no difference between ourselves and all sentient beings. We all want happiness and we want to be freed from suffering and pain. But when we hear this, we don't, whilst we understand and will accept this, perhaps we don't always understand it so correctly, because the happiness that is referred to here is not the happiness that we experience and we actually long for. It's a happiness that we have yet to experience, uncontaminated happiness. That is the happiness that beings truly need. Whether they have any concept of what uncontaminated happiness is or not, that is lasting, stable happiness. So usually when we think of happiness, happiness experiences, feelings of happiness, it's this contaminated happiness. Happiness that is impermanent and in the nature of suffering. So this is the first point to be aware of when we say that all beings want happiness. Whilst what beings tend to long for is contaminated happiness. But here in our Dharma context, we're specifically referring to uncontaminated happiness that beings need. Whilst on one level, we can say all beings want happiness and to be freed from suffering, therefore there's no difference. And that there does refer to contaminated happiness in terms of what beings truly long for. It is uncontaminated happiness. Then moreover, the way that we should relate to this, what has been presented here thus far this morning, is we need to understand the role that feelings play, bearing in mind that feelings accompany every single consciousness. Feelings are always present for us, whether pleasant or unpleasant feelings. So therefore, we need to understand clearly the role they play and then watch for that role. See the impact that feelings have in a chain of events. So this we need to recognize. Because first, here in this class, hopefully knowledge has been gathered. Whilst you're thinking about what is being said, or thinking about what you are hearing, you're integrating, deepening your understanding of that knowledge. And this you need to now continue in meditation, seeing the role that feelings play. That when there's an object of consciousness, immediately a feeling arises. And that feeling can be pleasant or unpleasant. And let's say it's an unpleasant feeling that arises. Then from this immediately comes the thought of wanting to be separated from that unpleasant feeling and that object that caused the unpleasant feeling. Thereby, this wanting to be separated is attachment, And this then leads to the accumulation of contaminated karma. And that affliction of attachment may be acted on, such as through verbal communication or physical activity, or perhaps through even more mental activity. So take this presentation here and think of a situation where you have got frustrated or annoyed with someone, or perhaps even angry towards them. And you'll see that that person was the object, but their mere being an object is insufficient for the arisal of anger. They would need to have done something, perhaps just a facial expression, or said something, specific words, or maybe even just a tone of voice. Then, in dependence on that, an unpleasant feeling arose, leading to perhaps anger towards them, or something milder, such as the attachment, wanting to be separated from them, perhaps both. Then, from that, those are afflictions that have now arisen. And thereby, already contaminated karma, non-virtuous karma is being accumulated, non-virtuous contaminated karma is being accumulated, and thereafter one may respond verbally oneself, or maybe even physically with one's own negative facial expression, compounding the non-virtuous contaminated karma being accumulated. So see that sequence, and then think of several more illustrations so you gain conviction in the sequence. Recognize here the role that feelings play. Recognize the harm that the afflictions play. Recognize the harm that acting under the influence of the afflictions play. Then, having seen this clearly through many illustrations and recognize the harm of the various parts of this, one can then commit to trying to break the sequence. And one can, ideally, the earlier in the sequence one breaks it, the better. But even if further down the sequence one puts an end to this, that is certainly excellent as well. So anywhere in this sequence, one through training can break this chain. So whether it's when you see someone, or you know you're going to come into contact with someone you don't get on with, or when you see someone with an adverse facial expression or tone of voice, or speaking to you in a particular way, or using words that you trigger, be aware at this point, this is danger. And watch your mind and try and prevent the arisal of an unpleasant feeling. Or, if the unpleasant feeling has arisen, be aware of this. Be aware of this, that the arisal of the unpleasant feeling will lead to attachment, wanting to be separated from this person, or anger, wanting to repel the person. And try and stop the sequence at the arisal of the unpleasant feeling. Or if one doesn't, as soon as one notices the attachment to be separated from them, or the arisal of anger or frustration or annoyance, bring that to an end. Bring the sequence to an end there. Don't allow further afflictions to arise, or one to act under the influence of the afflictions. So in this way, train your mind, break the sequence of non-virtue. And this is truly useful. Then, of course, one can do this too, and should do this too, in relation to feelings of pleasure. Seeing that in relation to a desirable object, a feeling of pleasure arises. So whether seeing something, hearing something, or even thinking of something desirable, a pleasant feeling comes. From this attachment, wanting it comes. And thereafter, further afflictions arise, or one will speak under the influence of attachment, or physically act under the influence of attachment. Recognize this through thinking of many illustrations, recognizing the faults of the pleasant feelings, the faults of the afflictions, the faults of acting under the influence of the afflictions. Then commit to breaking this chain wherever one can. As soon as one is aware of the mind taking a desirous object, try and break this chain before the arisal of the pleasant feeling. Or notice if the pleasant feeling has arisen, try and break the chain there before the arisal of attachment, wanting that object. Or if attachment has arisen, try and break the chain there before further afflictions arise, or before one physically or verbally acts under the influence of that affliction. Train your mind like this. Train your mind like this.
안데네 자당 저기 대두 가서 초와 되니기 가서 삼다야디다 나 저기 착바기기 유 초와 되야디 대화다 동아세 초와 되게 대화 삼다면나 되니기 대화디야다 나 저기라도 제바체도 대화디야 다 유위기 동안 내갑기 사지 되면데 땡기 대화되어 말당한서 근데 대화되면 무 뒤지 호랑기 균 뒤지 그디나 조아메바 대화치는 되기로 와디네 레요 말바자 당한도 삼당으로 대화디 당한도 대화디 가르때 나중에 착박이 얘기 대화디 되네 가네스도 랍나 다 호랑한지 그 내가 유단 뒤단 유에턴 되네 끼리마도 tempo che mutu ne me deken gyodo deken 지단 기지기 지니 규르 deken 지단 가상게 가서 일라 칼라사 지기 디와 바치 칼라사다 참저다 지기 디기 중요요데 디디기디 다도 여러베슨 무투지 균치만이에요 말다 매바잘 지단 가상게 대화대 지자 주직 지기 예를 대화기가 다디갑로 여러베슨 그 균디에요 말에 지단 디네자 균디 땡기 대화들이에요 말 지단 로버기 대화 그 남사 디디위치를 규르치 동아요야 치도록 제가 깨지기 지베라시 제가 그 미다바래 제가 되는 인자 도스치나 삼다이도 다고로 미다바 삼다이도 가르들 가르쳐버 요러세네 미다바 삼다베나 델이야 착바디 슈충을 기고라 착바디 대 착바 슈충을 기고라 봐 되는 인자 미다바 삼다야래 지나다 되는 게 선데 대야 안에 가르선 소와 대화디야 내가 아주길래 대화디 가르래 되니 기르세네 아주고 류디래 되니 기고르다 아주 류래 되니 기야다 지상 아주 류래 되니 기야디 류견색이 개색이 류대야 레다 녀모 준시베 되니질 되니 기고르 지다 되니 인상 코로나야 아니 유디 야고 메디해 되니지 코로나 유디야 야고 메 되니 코로나기에게 녀레 유다 되니기 겐디야 야고 메디 디네자 코 디네셰도와 삼다바이나 텔리아 차바다 아니 차바 슈충루 거래지래 진짜 디네자 다 초위 초와를 미제 고면도 미다고 고면도 동화와 고면 시고로와 디네자디 초와를 미비게 차바 슈 깨야 되나 시고로와
So further advice I want to share with how to engage in this meditation is call to mind objects of attachment, objects of desire. See that just calling it to mind, immediately a pleasant feeling arises, a feeling of happiness. So, for example, one can recall some delicious food, whatever it is that one really enjoys eating, and immediately a pleasant feeling arises. Perhaps even your mouth will salivate. So this is a feeling of happiness. But this feeling of happiness, we know is impermanent. We've eaten so many delicious meals in our life, and they're all long forgotten. Therefore, this happiness is not lasting or stable. If it were, that's a different story. But all the happiness that we've experienced, every single pleasant feeling, arises and disintegrates in the very next moment and then is gone. So this is the case with every single pleasant experience we've ever had. The recent good time we may have had with our friends, that too is gone. All these pleasant feelings that arose, in the very next moment, they disintegrate and are gone. So therefore, pleasant feelings are not worthy of grasping at, hoping that they'll bring some happiness, because that happiness is fleeting. It's fleeting. and it serves to impede the attainment of lasting stable happiness. So reflecting here on the general characteristic of impermanence, this serves to weaken our attachment. So too with reflecting on the general characteristic of suffering. Take the object, any object of attachment, for example the body, see how the body is in the nature of suffering because it came from contaminated karma. So its causes are what ensure that the resultant object, and again it can be any object, but for example the body, is in the nature of suffering because the cause was contaminated karma, and that karma is contaminated because it's accumulated due to the influence or under the influence of the afflictions. And because the causes have this grave fault, so too will the result. So therefore, any object of desire, whether our body or any other, is in the nature of suffering. It is faulty. It cannot lead to lasting stable happiness. It disintegrates and will disappoint us, lead to us always craving more, never being fulfilled. So reflecting then on how the objects of our desire, such as the body, are in the nature of suffering, this too helps to reduce our attachment.
Dine zadang an so chamba nyesha kombegi ane kunje te ba hu gure sadi an dusche dan dine zadang an jugi dan ine dang an jugi ne dunga temba dang kunju de be ne so ma shin we gengi dang an so ko wa khor te ba de dine zadang an so dunga temba dang kunju te be ne shin ko go dine zang an jugi ne sam ta ya de da su su gyu le ya chowa dewa dang dunga khane ki de kabla su su ya an de la mi bi ge chawa ki 차바기야도 진행할 숨도 삼다면에 소소랑게 소와 대화를 차는 가르치기도 세네 대화를 차에도 아니 차비 원기 레가디 아주기 두신 두고를 진짜 니시안라 녀바 차바다 딘 차상 아주기 소와 대화를 차다 소 동을 미디어바 델라 자두게 삼바기 두신이기는 아주기야 녀모바기 딘 기도와 선배다 소소랑 내가 가르치기도 심주시야로 와딘 용도와 nyumong pa jeba yina ana karingo sene digi ana xianlia tsusu xia da an ji xianlia nyoba jia kanga jia dine yungdu dine zang rang la ma jia xianlia ma jiba xianlia nyoba jigidu xianlia nyoba jigidu ta nyumong pa korang kongdu jia yungdu ne ten ko le ngan pa ti le yunggu re chizang ko yogi simgi tedu kongdu jia yungdu ne dua xia tong kongdu jia yungdu ne ngana zulia simgi nyuba de simgi tedu kar xia war sene le ngan pe pa xia xia go re 지산 디 샤고 지산 디게 원게 내가 알아줄이야 코발이야 나서는 기교를 제마 강아 쳐야다 자산 디네티네 용고래 선배게 두세 삼다이드와 셈데도 샤고에서 공로다 뒤샤기에도 레년베 바차디 가르쳐 셈미딘도 샤루고래 샤고레스 안디시 디엔 바샤샤니다 레년베 바차디 마음바나야 착바기 차비기 원게 디민벌 제제되는 알들이야 나서 기와련바딘데 용고 강아 쳐야지 차산딘데 용고래 삼다다 디네 인자다 아주 착바기에디 슉충 땅고 디네게 초월 미비게 초월 대화기네 착바 대월 미비 착바기 유문도 안에 동알나 델야 다두게 착바기 미도 셈비게 착바기에 가고도 셈비게 녀모바 가고 삼다다 다디네 인자다 착바기에 유대와들네 먼저 계시 대화데 가르스도 랍데 규 동아레스 자디 동아레 가서네 딱보 템보요 말 베네 자메기 대화 임바이네 그 대화지기 사회 제라 그런 기지기지 지루고데 이네 그런 규 무티지네 기디나 대화데 내려 규 무티지 대화데 니거로 와 지사 땅 알아서 풍부지 삼다면 당보기에는 그규 무티지 풍부지 발레 내리고 윤지니거로 그런 기지기 지고데 이네 윤니거로 디나시 사메기 대화제와는 대화제 사회제라 그렇게 지기 규루거든 이네 무디지 그런 윤치마치만 이거라서 다들 나란주 규래 대화 착바기 대화디 사제기 대화를 진짜 규유등하래 진짜 디 그런 윤 무디 니기도 진짜 대화도 쇼에 남사매 봐죠 진짜 만주기 얘기 대화디 배 지게 교우슈지레스 제가 디네자 딱바띠면 교우슈제 될라데 차바기는 시고직 차바기가 스케 민우선 비게 두섬 따베나 안델이야 안 차바슈 슈충 줘야지 차고로 인자 데네 지네가 주 리앙아 사고 데네 인자 대안당아 주 착바게 간 슬리기도 섬다 다보 소소나 섬다래 nga se samchili yore se nga se nga le deo ku su nga samdan nga le deo ku du sembe samje sina nga ra nga ta du sembe ta sen te de du a sembe du chine samda ba ina nga ju ina kunju temba ge jeba che ya da kunju temba ha ko ya le la ru go.
Therefore, as was said earlier, it's through reflecting on the close placement of mindfulness and feelings that leads us to understand true origins. And true origins still remain unknown to us, and it's because we have yet to realize true origins that we continue to accumulate causes for suffering. So through understanding the role that feelings play in the sequence from an object being observed to the arisal of the afflictions and the accumulation of karma, feelings play a key point, a key role. But whether that feeling is a pleasant feeling, a feeling of happiness, or an unpleasant feeling, a feeling of suffering. So this we need to come to recognize for ourselves in the way that I outlined a couple of segments ago. Because it's through the arisal of feelings that the afflictions come and we accumulate contaminated karma. And in particular, we should pay attention to pleasant feelings, because it's pleasant feelings that deceive us so. Pleasant feelings, or what we consider in the world happiness, deceive us. We believe that this is happiness worthy of striving for, and we feel such joy when we achieve. We put so much time and energy into achieving these feelings of happiness. And the problem with this is, perhaps we can say twofold, in that the arisal of pleasant feelings often will lead to the arisal of afflictions and the accumulation of contaminated karma, and that contaminated karma may often be non-virtuous, wanting something for ourselves. Our self-cherishing is strong, place ourselves first, and we bring harm to others. So thereby, from this arisal of a pleasant feeling, we end up creating causes that will result in our suffering. Second key fault that comes from following pleasant feelings is that the afflictions that follow from this lead us to engage in so many activities, mental, physical, and verbal, that consume our lives, consume our mental energy, consume our time, and lead to us wasting this precious opportunity. So in these two ways, the following of pleasant feelings directly and indirectly bring us harm to ourselves as well as to others. So this is a key point to reflect on, because we do not see pleasant feelings as a fault, and this therefore keeps us bound in samsara, keeps us bound in that we continue to strive for happiness which has no true value, no real worth. And because of following our feelings, whether pleasant or unpleasant, our afflictions arise. The more habituated we are to this process, the stronger those afflictions are within us, and thereby the more readily they arise, and the stronger they are when they arise, and the longer they will remain manifest for. And we see this in terms of our virtuous minds that we are less habituated to. They need constant, or they need intentional generation, and they fade quickly. So by meditating on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, and utilizing the skill to use, it will weaken your attachment as well as thereby your anger. And as we weaken our habituation to the afflictions, they will ripen less readily. When they ripen, they will remain manifest for less long, and thereby we will start to experience more peace. So in this meditation, we come to understand clearly what contaminated happiness is. It's impermanent, does not last, and it is in the nature of suffering. And thereby we can also come to understand what is uncontaminated happiness, the happiness that truly beings need and long for. This is happiness that does not degenerate. It is not in the nature of suffering. It is completely the opposite. So here, we need to recognize the fault of both pleasant and unpleasant feelings and their place in this chain of events. And in particular, pay attention to pleasant feelings, because these are what really deceive us. And through recognizing the fault of pleasant feelings, we should also recognize the fault of contaminated happiness. Because we are capable of so much more. But striving for contaminated happiness limits us and prevents us from developing into the extraordinary beings that we can become. And then the last point to make. In your meditations, as you gain familiarity with these varying points, also look at the root cause of all of this ignorance of self-grasping. And in the way that has been described previously and will be again, reflect on how the self does not exist in the way that it appears. It's empty of existing in the way that it appears. And this is the key meditation that will actually lead us to realize true origins. So thank you. We'll finish here for this morning, and then this afternoon we'll look at the close placement of mindfulness on the mind, and how through reflecting on that one comes to engage with true cessations. So thank you very much.